Something extraordinary is happening inside the most powerful military institution on Earth. Not on a battlefield, not in a foreign capital, inside Washington, D.C., inside the Pentagon itself. For the first time in modern American history, a sitting president is facing what intelligence insiders are quietly describing as a crisis of command authority, a fracturing of the foundational relationship between the commander-in-chief and the generals sworn to carry out his orders. The word coming out of the Pentagon is not confusion, it is not hesitation, it is defiance. Senior military officials, men and women who have spent decades ascending through the most rigorous institutional hierarchy in the world, are reportedly refusing to implement directives coming directly from the White House. The details are still emerging, but the pattern is unmistakable, and the implications are staggering. This is not a bureaucratic slowdown. This is not a scheduling dispute. What we are watching unfold in real time is a constitutional stress test unlike anything the United States has experienced since the firing of General Douglas MacArthur in 1951. And even that crisis did not carry the ideological weight or the institutional depth of what is now breaking across Washington. Let that settle for a moment. When generals defy a president, the entire architecture of American civil-military relations, the invisible framework that separates democracy from authoritarianism, begins to tremble. The United States military operates on a doctrine of civilian supremacy. The president commands, the military obeys. That is not merely tradition, that is law. That is the constitutional order. And right now, that order is under enormous strain. Sources with knowledge of internal Pentagon deliberations describe a climate of deep institutional unease. Career military officers, many of them appointed across multiple administrations, are said to be raising formal and informal objections to a series of White House directives. Directives they view as politically motivated, legally questionable, or operationally dangerous. The White House, according to multiple reports, is not taking this quietly. Aides close to the president are described as furious. Senior advisors are scrambling. Emergency meetings are being convened. And the question being asked in the most powerful rooms in Washington right now is one that no administration ever wants to face. What do you do when the generals say no? This story matters far beyond the politics of one administration. It matters because the United States military is not just an American institution, it is the central pillar of global security architecture. What happens inside the Pentagon reverberates in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and every NATO capital simultaneously. If the chain of command is broken, or even perceived to be broken, adversaries take note, allies grow anxious, markets react, and the consequences can escalate with terrifying speed. We are going to walk you through exactly what is happening, how it got to this point, and what it means for the United States and the world. Stay with us. And if you want to follow this story as it develops, because it will develop, subscribe now, hit the bell. This is the kind of story that changes by the hour. To understand what is happening inside the Pentagon today, you have to understand how America arrived at this moment. Because this crisis did not begin overnight, it has roots that stretch back decades, through wars, through political upheaval, and through a slow, grinding erosion of the norms that once governed the relationship between America's elected leaders and its uniformed military. Let's go back to the beginning. The principle of civilian control over the military was not an accident of American democracy. It was a deliberate architectural decision by the Founding Fathers, men who had lived under the shadow of military coups, royal armies, and unchecked martial power. The Constitution placed the president at the apex of the military command structure precisely to ensure that no general, no admiral, no armed institution could ever supersede the democratic will of the American people. For nearly 2.5 centuries, that structure held. It held through the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln navigated constant tension with his generals. It held through World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt managed the enormous egos and competing visions of Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Patton. It held even through the most explosive test of the modern era, April 1951, when President Harry Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur for publicly defying his Korean War strategy. MacArthur was a national hero. Truman was deeply unpopular. And yet the principle held. The civilian removed the general. The chain of command survived. That precedent has anchored American civil-military relations ever since. But the cracks began forming long before the current crisis. During the final months of the first Trump administration, the friction between the White House and senior military leadership became visible in ways that alarmed defense scholars and former officials alike. In the summer of 2020, then Defense Secretary Mark Esper publicly broke with the president over the potential use of active-duty military forces against American protesters. An extraordinary public rupture between a sitting president and his own Pentagon chief. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, was photographed walking through Lafayette Square in battle dress, an image he later called one of the greatest regrets of his professional life, precisely because it appeared to align the military with a political moment. Milley himself, in the closing days of that administration, took steps that have never been fully declassified, steps reportedly designed to ensure that no unlawful military orders would be carried out without proper oversight. These were not small events. They were institutional warning signals. Then came the transition, the elections, the political turbulence, and eventually the return to power. By the time the current administration began issuing military directives in its early weeks, the Pentagon was already operating in a state of heightened institutional vigilance. Career officers had watched, studied, and in many cases documented what had happened during the previous period of civil-military tension. They had consulted lawyers. They had reviewed the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They had studied the precise legal boundaries of lawful versus unlawful orders. They were not unprepared. And so when directives began arriving from the White House that, in the view of senior officers, crossed critical lines involving the deployment of troops for domestic political purposes, lines involving intelligence sharing protocols, lines involving the treatment of military personnel, the institutional resistance did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from years of preparation, legal study, and quiet, deliberate resolve. The timeline leading to today's crisis is not the story of rogue generals acting on impulse. It is the story of an institution that saw this moment coming and chose, with full awareness of the consequences, to stand its ground. Now let's get specific. Because in a story this consequential, the details matter enormously. What exactly happened? What orders were issued? What did the Pentagon refuse? And how did a simmering institutional tension become an open, documented rupture between the White House and the uniformed military leadership of the United States? Here is what we know, and what remains contested. According to multiple reports from senior defense correspondents and officials speaking on condition of anonymity, the current crisis crystallized around a cluster of specific White House directives issued in rapid succession. These directives, described by insiders as arriving with unusual speed and limited interagency consultation, touched on three distinct areas of military authority, each one sensitive in isolation and collectively explosive in combination. The first involved the potential redeployment of active-duty military personnel to support domestic law enforcement operations along the southern border. Senior Pentagon officials, including uniformed officers at the Joint Chiefs level, raised immediate legal and operational objections. The Posse Comitatus Act, the federal law that strictly limits the use of the U.S. military in domestic law enforcement, was cited directly. Career military lawyers flagged the directives as legally problematic. The objections were formally registered. The White House pushed back hard. The second directive involved proposed changes to the military's intelligence sharing protocols with key NATO allies, changes that career officials described as abrupt, unexplained, and potentially damaging to critical alliance relationships built over 70 years. Senior officers in the intelligence community raised concerns through proper channels. Those concerns were reportedly dismissed without substantive review. The third, and most explosive, involves personnel decisions. Reports indicate the White House has been seeking to accelerate the removal of certain senior military officers viewed as insufficiently loyal to the administration's political agenda, while simultaneously fast-tracking promotions for officers seen as more ideologically aligned. Career military officials describe this as an unprecedented politicization of the promotion and assignment process, a direct assault on the institutional independence that allows the military to function across administrations of both parties. Now, the White House tells a fundamentally different story. Administration officials, speaking through formal channels and aligned media outlets, characterize the Pentagon's resistance not as principled institutional pushback, but as insubordination driven by a politically entrenched bureaucratic class, what they call the deep state in uniform. They argue the president has the full constitutional authority to direct military deployments, restructure alliance arrangements, and shape the senior leadership of his own armed forces. They frame the general's resistance as an illegitimate obstruction of democratically expressed executive authority. And here's the uncomfortable truth that serious analysts must acknowledge. They are not entirely wrong on the constitutional question. The president does hold expansive authority over the military. The Posse Comitatus Act contains exceptions. Intelligence sharing arrangements can be legally modified. Promotions and assignments do ultimately flow through civilian authority. The legal picture is not clean on either side. What makes this crisis different, what elevates it beyond a standard civil-military policy dispute, is the scope, the speed, and the institutional breadth of the resistance. This is not one general raising one objection through one formal channel. This is a pattern of pushback across multiple commands, multiple departments, and multiple layers of the military hierarchy, simultaneous, coordinated, and increasingly visible to the outside world. Military sources describe internal meetings where officers are consulting judge, advocate general lawyers before responding to White House communications. They describe a climate in which officers are documenting every directive, every conversation, every instruction, creating paper trails with a deliberateness that speaks to institutional awareness that these records may one day matter enormously. That is not the behavior of bureaucrats caught off guard. That is the behavior of an institution that believes it is living through a historical moment and intends to be on the right side of the record when history renders its judgment. The full picture is still emerging. Key documents remain classified. Several central figures have declined to speak publicly. And the most consequential decisions, the ones that will determine whether this crisis deepens or recedes, have not yet been made. But the contours are clear, the fault lines are visible, and the next move belongs to the White House. Step back from the headlines for a moment. Step back from the personalities, the directives, the legal disputes, and the political noise. And ask the question that every serious defense analyst is asking right now in Washington, London, Brussels, and Beijing. What does it actually mean, strategically, militarily, and geopolitically, when the Pentagon and the White House are in open conflict? The answer is more consequential than most people realize, and it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Begin with the most immediate strategic reality. The United States military is not simply a large armed force. It is the central organizing institution of the entire post-World War II global security order. 70-plus years of alliance architecture, NATO, the Indo-Pacific Security Framework, bilateral defense treaties across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and East Asia. All of it rests on a foundational assumption that is rarely stated but absolutely critical. That assumption is this: the American military is reliable, coherent, and commands a unified chain of authority, from the president down through the Joint Chiefs, to every combatant commander in every theater of operation around the world. The moment that assumption is called into question, even for a single news cycle, the strategic consequences begin cascading outward with a speed and breadth that is genuinely alarming to defense planners. Consider what is happening in Moscow right now. Russian military and intelligence planners monitor American civil-military relations with extraordinary precision. They have entire analytical divisions dedicated to identifying and exploiting fractures in American institutional cohesion. A Pentagon in visible tension with the White House is not merely an interesting political story to the Kremlin. It is a strategic signal, a potential indicator that American resolve, American command coherence, and American deterrence credibility may be degraded, even temporarily. In the context of an ongoing war in Ukraine, where American military aid and strategic signaling play a critical role in shaping Russian calculations, even a perceived weakening of American command authority carries enormous operational weight. Now look east. Beijing's strategic planners are equally attentive. China's military doctrine places enormous emphasis on what strategists call will assessment, the evaluation of an adversary's internal cohesion and political resolve as a predictor of battlefield behavior. The People's Liberation Army does not simply count American aircraft carriers and missile batteries. It counts the distance between the commander-in-chief and his generals. It watches for institutional fractures. It game plans around moments of American political distraction. Taiwan is always in that calculus. A Pentagon distracted by internal civil-military conflict is a Pentagon with reduced bandwidth for the kind of coordinated, high-tempo deterrence signaling that keeps Chinese adventurism in check across the Taiwan Strait. Move now to the Middle East. American force posture across the region, from the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar to the sprawling logistics infrastructure in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Djibouti, depends on rapid, coherent command decisions flowing from a unified civilian military structure. Iran's military planners, like their Russian and Chinese counterparts, watch American institutional coherence closely. Any signal of fractured command authority in Washington emboldens Iranian proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon to probe American red lines with greater aggression. The strategic geography of American military power is not separate from the political geography of Washington. They are the same map. There is also a deeper institutional dimension that cannot be overstated. The United States military's global effectiveness rests not just on its weapons systems, its logistics capacity, or its intelligence networks. It rests on the credibility of its command culture, the world's belief that when an American general gives an order, that order flows from a coherent, legitimate, and unified chain of authority. If that credibility is damaged, if allies begin to wonder whether Pentagon commitments reflect stable institutional policy or the volatile preferences of a fractured civilian-military relationship, the entire architecture of American deterrence begins to erode. NATO allies are already asking quiet questions. Senior European defense officials, speaking privately at recent security forums, have expressed concern about the reliability of American command signals in the current environment. South Korean and Japanese defense planners, whose security depends on rapid, credible American military responses, are recalibrating their threat assessments in light of Washington's internal turbulence. This is the strategic cost of a broken chain of command. It is not measured in battles lost or territories surrendered. It is measured in the slow, quiet withdrawal of global confidence in American institutional authority, confidence that took decades to build and can be lost with alarming speed. The Pentagon knows this. The generals know this. And that knowledge, more than any individual directive, more than any specific legal dispute, is what is driving the depth and the urgency of the institutional resistance now unfolding inside the most powerful military headquarters on Earth.